October 1983, Harlan County. The last of the corn had been harvested from the South 40, and the field lay exposed under a flat, gray sky. It was a landscape of failure. The stalks, cut low by the combine, were thin and pale, the color of old bone. The ground between the rows was not the rich, dark loam of the surrounding valley, but a compacted, lifeless pan the color of ash. When the wind came down from the ridges, it did not stir the soil. It lifted it in fine, choking sheets of dust that coated the fence lines and settled in the creases of the barn roof. The field was not resting. It was barren. Arthur Pearsall stood at the edge of the county road, his hands resting on the cool, flaking paint of a metal gatepost. He was 72 years old, and he had known this piece of land his entire life. He had seen it when it was dark and vibrant, a place that could grow corn so tall a man could get lost between the rows. That was a long time ago. He wore a denim work shirt, faded to the color of the sky, and gray trousers held up by suspenders. His face was a map of his years, the lines around his eyes and mouth carved not by worry, but by wind and sun and a lifetime of quiet observation. The problem with the South 40 was not new, but it had reached a critical stage. For 15 years, its yields had declined. Each season, the solution offered by the men at the co-op was the same. More nitrogen, more phosphate, more potash. He had followed the advice for a time, buying the brightly colored bags of granular fertilizer and watching them spin out behind his tractor, a chemical prayer for a harvest that grew more meager with each passing year. The inputs went up and the output went down. It was the kind of math that led to foreclosure signs on neighboring farms. Arthur was debt-free. His father, Thomas Pearsall, had instilled in him a deep and abiding distrust of banks. A man who owns his land and his tools, Thomas used to say, answers to God and the weather, and no one else. Arthur had lived by that creed. He did not own a new tractor. His equipment was old but meticulously maintained. He did not chase market trends. He grew corn and hay, and he kept a small herd of Hereford cattle that grazed the hill pastures. But the South 40 was a drain. It cost more in seed and fuel and chemicals than it returned in grain. It had become a 40-acre liability. The history of its failure was written in the soil itself. Men from the University Extension Office had come and gone over the years. They had taken soil samples, run tests, and produced reports filled with numbers and charts. They talked about pH imbalance, about nutrient lockout, about cation exchange capacity. They recommended tons of lime, which he had applied. They recommended new hybrids of seed, which he had planted. They recommended different tilling methods, which he had tried. Each solution was a temporary patch on a deeply wounded piece of earth. The land, they concluded, was simply played out. It was a common story in the valley, a tale of soil that had given all it had to give. The consensus was to let it go to scrub, to fence it off, and forget it. The next morning, a clean, white pickup truck with the State University logo on the door pulled into Arthur's lane. A young man stepped out. He was no older than 30, with a crisp shirt, neatly pressed trousers, and an air of unshakable confidence. He carried an aluminum clipboard and a soil probe. This was Daniel Hines, the new county extension agent. "Mr. Pearsall," he said, extending a hand. His grip was firm and brief. "Daniel Hines. Just wanted to introduce myself. I'm taking over for Bill Henderson." Arthur nodded. He had known Bill Henderson for 20 years. Bill had been the one to first call the South 40 a tough nut to crack. "Heard you had some trouble with the South field again this year," Hines said. It was not a question. He had already reviewed the county yield reports. His job was to bring modern, data-driven agriculture to farmers like Arthur. "It was a poor year for that field," Arthur said. The statement was plain, holding no emotion. "Mind if I take a look? I've got the file on it, but I like to see the ground for myself." Hines was already walking toward the gate, his boots making clean, precise tracks in the dusty soil. Arthur followed. Hines walked a grid pattern across the field, stopping every 100 feet to drive his gleaming soil probe into the earth. He would pull up a core of soil, crumble it between his fingers, look at it with a critical eye, and then place a sample into a small, numbered bag. He worked with an efficient, practiced air. He was a man who believed in data, in the quantifiable and the knowable. After an hour, he returned to his truck, his boots now covered in the pale dust. He leaned against the tailgate, making notes on his clipboard. "Well, the soil structure is shot," he said, not looking at Arthur. "Compaction is severe. I'm guessing the organic matter is under 1%. There's almost no aggregation. It's basically inert." Arthur remained silent, his gaze fixed on the field. He knew the soil was poor. He did not need a young man with a college degree to tell him that. Hines flipped a page on his clipboard. "Bill's notes say you've tried lime and a standard October 10th 10 blend. Last year's recommendation was a high nitrogen 28-0-0 liquid application post-emergence." He looked up. "Did you follow that protocol?" "I did," Arthur said. "And the yield was still only 60 bushels to the acre." Hines shook his head with a kind of professional pity. "The valley average was 130. He tapped his pen on the clipboard. "Frankly, Mr. Pearsall, you're throwing good money after bad. The cost of the inputs on this field is higher than the market value of the crop." Arthur's gaze did not waver. "What do you suggest?" Hines took a deep breath, shifting into the part of his job that was about managing expectations. "The scientific approach points to a few options. 1, you could invest heavily. We're talking 5 tons of lime per acre start, followed by a deep subsoiling plow to break up the hardpan. Then, a custom fertilizer blend based on a full-spectrum lab analysis. That's going to be expensive, very expensive, and there's no guarantee it will pay off in the short term." He paused, letting the cost sink in. "Option 2, he continued, is to enroll it in the Conservation Reserve Program. Let go fallow for 10 years. Plant it in switchgrass. The government will pay you a small stipend. It's the most economically sensible path." Arthur's eyes moved from the field to the young man. He asked a simple question. "What about the life in the soil?" Hines blinked. He looked down at his clipboard, as if searching for a column with that label. "The life? You mean microbial activity?" He gave a small, condescending smile. "Well, yes, microbial activity is a component of soil health, but in a depleted profile like this, it's negligible. You can't build a house on a rotten foundation. We have to fix the basic chemistry first. The rest is just old-timer talk, no offense." He snapped the clipboard shut. "I'll run these samples at the lab in the city. I'll have a full report with precise chemical recommendations for you in 2 weeks. But I'll tell you right now, the numbers are going to be grim. My advice, cut your losses. That field is done." Hines got back in his truck, the engine turning over with a quiet hum. He gave Arthur a final, sympathetic nod and drove away, leaving a plume of pale dust hanging in the still air. Arthur stood by the gate long after the truck had disappeared, looking at the wounded land. He was not thinking about chemistry. He was thinking about his father. A few days later, Arthur drove his 1968 Ford F-100 into town for supplies. The truck was the same dark green as the woods in summer, its engine a low rumble that was as familiar to him as his own breathing. He parked in front of the Harlan County Co-op, a long metal building that smelled of feed grain, fertilizer, and old coffee. Inside, a group of farmers stood around the counter, nursing styrofoam cups. Frank, the manager, was holding court. Frank was a large man whose opinions were as firm as the concrete floor. The arrival of the new extension agent was the topic of the day. "That new fella, Hines, he came by my place," said a farmer named Dale, leaning against a stack of salt blocks. "All numbers and spreadsheets. Told me I was losing 20 cents a bushel by not forward contracting. He was out at Pearsall's," another man added, and the group's attention shifted to Arthur as he walked toward the hardware aisle. The men nodded at him, a gesture of neighborly respect, but their conversation continued in lower tones. "Looked at that old South 40 of his," Frank said, loud enough for Arthur to hear. "I told Bill Henderson years ago that field was poisoned. Too much anhydrous ammonia back in the 70s. Killed it dead." Arthur continued walking, his worn boots making no sound on the dusty floor. He needed cotter pins for his disc harrow and a new filter for the farmel. He knew they were talking about him. In a small community, a failing field was a public matter, a subject for speculation and judgment. As he paid Frank for his parts, Frank leaned in conspiratorially. "Arthur, that Hines fellow was in here yesterday. Said he was running tests on your south field. Said it was the worst dirt he'd seen in the whole state. Told me he advised you to put it in the government program." Arthur placed the bills on the counter. "He did." Frank shook his head, a look of genuine pity on his face. "It's a shame, but he's probably right. No sense fighting a dead horse. That ground's had the life beat out of it." The chorus of farmers murmured in agreement. They were not unkind men. They were practical. They saw a problem with no affordable solution. They saw a fellow farmer on a fool's errand. Their consensus echoed the extension agent science. The South 40 was a lost cause. Arthur's quiet persistence was seen not as wisdom, but as the stubbornness of an old man who couldn't accept the facts. He was an object of pity, a relic of a bygone era, clinging to a piece of dead earth. That evening, Arthur did not sit on his porch to watch the sunset. He walked past the barn to the old workshop his father had built from salvaged timber in 1938. The air inside was cool and still, thick with the scent of motor oil, sawdust, and time. Tools hung from the walls in their designated places, their wooden handles dark and smooth from decades of use. Nothing was new, but everything was clean and sharp and ready. In the back corner, under a canvas tarp, sat a small, heavy metal box. It was an old Army surplus ammunition can, painted black. Arthur lifted it and carried it to his father's workbench. The hinges groaned as he opened the lid. Inside, nestled among old deeds and tax records, was a notebook. It was a simple ledger book, its leather cover worn soft and its corners rounded. The pages were filled with his father's handwriting, a strong, clear script made with a fountain pen. The book was not a diary. It was a record of the farm, year by year, from 1920 to 1965. It noted planting dates, rainfall, harvest yields, and observations about the land. Arthur turned the brittle pages carefully. He was not looking for data. He was looking for a memory. He found in the entries for the late 1940s, a time when the South 40 had produced the best corn in the county. His father's notes were detailed. He had not written about NPK ratios. He had written about cover crops, about manure from the cattle, and about something else. Arthur closed his eyes. The memory came to him not as a picture, but as a feeling, a sound. He was a boy of 10, standing beside his father at the edge of that same field. The corn was a towering green forest. His father, Thomas, was a tall, quiet man who moved with a purpose that seemed to come from the earth itself. "You see that, son?" Thomas had said, his voice a low rumble. He was pointing at the soil, not the plants. It was dark and crumbly, teeming with earthworms. "That's the secret. It's not dirt. It's a pantry. You keep the pantry full, the family eats." The memory sharpened. He remembered the smell. A strong, pungent, oceanic smell that seemed out of place so far from the coast. He remembered the barrels in the back of his father's truck and the work they had done before planting. The men at the university, Thomas had told him one spring morning, his hands deep in the soil, "They're smart men, but they read books. The soil is a living thing. You give it a good meal, and it'll do the work for you. It'll feed the plant better than any man in a laboratory ever could." That was the core principle, the central thesis of his father's life as a farmer. It was a truth that had been forgotten, dismissed as old-timer talk. Arthur opened his eyes and looked down at the notebook. On a page dated April 1948, he found the specific instructions. The elegant script was clear and direct. It detailed an arrangement his father had with a man who ran a fish processing plant down on the river 30 miles away. It specified what to get: the heads, the bones, the guts. The gurry, they called it. The waste. The notebook laid out the method. One large fish head and frame for every cornstalk. Buried in a hole, 6 inches deep and 4 inches to the side of where the seed would be planted. The timing was crucial. It had to be done after the last frost, but before the ground grew too warm. The entry ended with a simple declarative statement: "The soil is hungry for the sea. It remembers." Arthur read the page 3 times. The math did not require a pencil. The South 40, planted in 30-inch rows, held approximately 28,000 cornstalks. He would need 28,000 fish heads. He would need to dig 28,000 holes. It was an immense amount of labor. It was a task that a modern farmer, with his wide planters and chemical applicators, would consider insane. He closed the notebook and placed it back in a metal box. He sat on the stool at his father's workbench for a long time as the light faded outside. The report from Daniel Hines would arrive in a week or two, filled with charts and graphs and decimal points, a precise and scientific autopsy of his dead field. It would be logical, data-driven, and completely wrong. Arthur stood up. The decision had been made. He would not be feeding the plant. He would be feeding the soil. The next Monday, Arthur drove his F-100 not to town, but east, following the winding two-lane road that traced the path of the Harland River. He drove past farms and small towns until he reached the industrial outskirts of a larger city. There, tucked away behind a chain-link fence, was a low, concrete building with steam rising from its vents. A simple sign read, Harland River Fisheries. He found the owner, a man named Mike, in a small, cluttered office that smelled of stale coffee and fish. Mike was a heavy-set man in his 50s, his hands permanently stained and calloused. "Can I help you?" Mike asked, his eyes appraising Arthur's work clothes and old truck. "My name is Arthur Pearsall," he said. "My father was Thomas Pearsall. You used to do business with your father, I believe, back in the 40s and 50s. Mike's expression softened. "Tom Pearsall? Sure, I remember my dad talking about him. The farmer who came for the gurry. Haven't had anyone ask for that stuff in 30 years. We pay a rendering plant to haul it away now. I'd like to take it instead," Arthur said. Mike leaned back in his chair, studying the old man. "All of it. We process a lot of catfish and carp. We fill a dozen 55-gallon drums with heads and guts every day." "I'll take what you can spare," Arthur said. "I can haul 6 barrels at a time in my truck." A slow grin spread across Mike's face. "You want to pay me for my trash? I'll pay you what the rendering plant pays you," Arthur said. "And I'll do the hauling myself." The deal was struck. It was a better arrangement for Mike, saving him the disposal fee. For Arthur, it was the first step. He backed his truck up to the loading dock, and 2 workers used a forklift to load 6 sealed drums into the bed. The weight settled the old truck down on its springs. The smell, even through the sealed lids, was potent. It was the smell of the river, of life and decay, a primal odor that had been absent from his fields for decades. He did this quietly. He made the trip to the fishery twice a week through the late fall and winter. He did not go to the co-op. He did not speak of his plan to anyone. He stockpiled the barrels behind his barn, away from the road. The work was methodical. He had chosen a spot his father had used, a long, shallow trench dug into the earth. Following the instructions in the notebook, he emptied the fish parts into the trench, layering them with sawdust he got for free from a local sawmill and with soil from the woods. This was not just storage, it was the beginning of a process. A slow, cool compost that would break down the flesh just enough to make its nutrients available when the soil warmed in the spring. He covered the trench with a thick layer of straw and a heavy tarp. Through the winter months, he worked on his equipment. He took apart the carburetor on the Farmland Model H, cleaning the jets with a fine wire. He replaced the gaskets. He sharpened the discs on his harrow until they were like razors. He oiled the chains. He repaired the seat on his old 2-row corn planter. Each task was done with a slow, deliberate care. These tools were his partners. They were extensions of his own hands and his own will. They were old, but they were not obsolete. Spring arrived, and the land began to thaw. The air grew soft, and the first hints of green appeared on the south-facing slopes. It was time. Arthur hitched the moldboard plow to the farmel. The tractor was a 1947 model. Its red paint faded to a dull orange. It had no cab, no radio, no computer. When Arthur started it, the engine turned over with a deep, percussive rhythm that echoed across the valley. He plowed the South 40. He drove the tractor in perfectly straight lines, turning the pale, dead soil over, exposing it to the air. The other farmers in the valley were switching to no-till farming, a modern technique promoted by Daniel Hines to prevent erosion. Arthur's plowing was seen as another sign of his refusal to adapt. They saw an old man turning dust into bigger dust. After plowing, he let the field rest for 2 weeks. Then came the next step. He did not use a tractor for this. He used 2 wooden stakes, a ball of twine, and a measuring tape. He walked to one end of the field and hammered a stake into the ground. He unwound the twine, walking in a dead straight line to the other end, a quarter of a mile away. He pulled the line taut and hammered in the second stake. This was his guide. This was how his father had ensured the rows were perfect. Then the real work began. He took a simple, manual post-hole digger, its wooden handles smoothed by his father's hands and his own. He started at the stake and moved down the twine line. Every 30 inches, he would stop, position the digger, and drive it into the earth. He would open the handles, lift out a plug of soil, and set it beside the hole. The hole was precise, 6 inches deep. He did this all day, every day for 3 weeks. The rhythm was grueling. Step, measure, dig, lift. Step, measure, dig, lift. His back ached. His hands were raw, even through his leather gloves. But his mind was clear. He was not just digging holes. He was preparing a feast. Each hole was a plate, set for a guest of honor. The community watched. They saw his old truck parked by the field day after day. They saw the small, solitary figure bent over a post-hole digger in the vast, empty expanse. The talk at the co-op turned from pity to a kind of morbid curiosity. What in God's name is he doing now? Dale asked one morning. He's been out there for weeks, poking holes in the ground. Frank heard from a trucker that Pearsall's been hauling fish guts, another man said, and a wave of disbelief and laughter went through the store. Frank, the manager, shook his head. The old man's finally lost it. He's planting stink bait, probably trying to grow catfish. The joke was repeated all over the county. Arthur Pearsall, the man who planted fish. Daniel Hines drove by the South 40 on his way to another farm. He saw Arthur, a tiny figure in the distance, methodically digging. He slowed his truck, a frown on his face. He had delivered his report to Arthur a month earlier. It was a 20-page document detailing the field's severe deficiencies, complete with colored charts and a list of chemical inputs that would cost thousands of dollars. Arthur had accepted the report with a quiet thank you and had not mentioned it since. Hines watched for a few moments, then shook his head and drove on. He made a note on his clipboard. Pearsall engaged in unconventional, non-scientific soil preparation. Appears to be digging holes by hand. Psychological evaluation may be warranted. He saw it as the final, sad act of a farmer who had fallen out of touch with reality, a man retreating into nonsensical rituals in the face of insurmountable facts. Arthur was oblivious to the mockery and the pity. He was focused on the task. After the last hole was dug, he brought the truck to the edge of the field. The composted fish parts were no longer raw. They had broken down into a thick, dark, pungent mash. He shoveled it into a 5-gallon bucket and began the next phase. He walked the rows, carrying the bucket. At each hole, he would reach in with a gloved hand, take out a single fish head and the attached frame, and place it carefully at the bottom. One per hole. He did not rush. Each placement was deliberate. He was making an offering. 28,000 offerings to the depleted earth. When all the fish were buried, he walked the rows again, using a hoe to pull the plug of soil back over the hole, covering the offering. The field looked unchanged, except for the thousands of small, circular patches of disturbed earth. Finally, it was time to plant. He hitched the old John Deere 2-row planter to the farmel. He filled the seed hoppers with a standard variety of hybrid corn. He did not use any starter fertilizer in the planter, a practice unheard of in modern farming. He drove the tractor slowly, carefully, keeping the wheels in line with his markers. The planter plates dropped a single kernel of corn into the soil, for inches to the side of each buried fish head. He finished planting in the second week of May. The work was done. He had followed his father's instructions to the letter. He had ignored the advice of the experts, the laughter of his neighbors, and the evidence of his own eyes that told him the field was dead. He had placed his faith in a forgotten process. Now, all he could do was wait. For 2 weeks, the field remained a flat expanse of pale brown soil. The sun warmed the earth. A gentle rain fell. From the road, it looked like any other planted field, empty and expectant. Arthur watched it from his porch, his face impassive. He knew the first signs to look for. It was Daniel Hines' new assistant who noticed it first. Her name was Sarah Jenkins. She was young, fresh out of agricultural college, and unlike Hines, she was more curious than confident. She was driving past the Pearsall farm on a routine survey when she slowed her truck, a puzzled look on her face. The corn in the South 40 was coming up. That was not unusual. What was unusual was its uniformity. In every other field in the valley, germination was a staggered affair, with some plants emerging strong and others lagging behind. But in Arthur's field, the corn was emerging as a single, unified green wave. It was as if every single seed had sprouted at the exact same moment. The rows were perfectly straight, and the tiny seedlings stood at attention like soldiers on parade. The germination rate appeared to be nearly 100%. She made a note in her logbook. Pearsall field showing unusually high and uniform germination. A week later, the difference became undeniable. The corn was not just growing, it was exploding. The seedlings were a deep, vibrant, almost blue-green, a color Sarah had only seen in textbook photographs of perfectly healthy plants. They were thicker, more robust than the corn in the adjacent fields, which were already showing the pale yellow tinge of nitrogen deficiency. The talk at the co-op began to change. The jokes about planting fish faded, replaced by a grudging curiosity. Farmers who had laughed at Arthur now made excuses to drive down the county road past his farm. They would slow their trucks, gaze at the burgeoning field, and shake their heads in bewilderment. By the middle of June, the South 40 was a spectacle. The corn was growing at a pace that defied explanation. It was already waist-high, while corn planted at the same time on other farms was barely knee-high. The stalks were not just tall, they were thick, as sturdy as broom handles. The leaves were broad and dark, capturing every possible ray of sunlight. The field did not look like it belonged in the same valley as its neighbors. It looked like something from a seed catalog, an idealized image of agricultural perfection. Daniel Hines was in his office, reviewing fertilizer trial data, when Sarah Jenkins came in. "You need to go see Arthur Pearsall's South Field," she said. "The dead field?" Hines asked, not looking up from his computer screen. "Did his fish planting experiment fail yet? I want to document it as a case study in folkloric agricultural fallacies." "No," Sarah said, her voice firm. "You need to go see it. Now." Hines, annoyed at the interruption but intrigued by her insistence, drove out to the Pearsall farm. He pulled his truck over at the same spot where he had delivered his grim prognosis months earlier. He got out and stared. He stood motionless for a full minute, his mouth slightly agape. The field he had declared done and inert was now a jungle. The corn was shoulder-high, a solid wall of deep green. It was the most vigorous, healthy-looking stand of corn he had ever seen in his life. It was impossible. It defied all the data, all his training, all the soil science he had ever learned. He grabbed his soil testing kit and walked into the field. The air inside the rows was humid and smelled richly of earth and chlorophyll. The ground beneath his feet was not the hard, compacted pan he remembered. It was soft and friable, dark with moisture. He knelt down and dug into the soil with his hands. It was teeming with earthworms. The pale, dead dust was gone, replaced by a dark, aggregated loam that clung together in rich clumps. He ran a field test for nitrogen. The reagent turned a deep, immediate violet. The levels were not just adequate. They were optimal, far higher than they should have been without the massive chemical application he had recommended. He tested for phosphorus and potassium. The results were the same. The soil was alive and bursting with nutrients. He stood up, wiping the dark soil from his hands onto his clean trousers without thinking. He looked at the corn, dwarfed by its impossible vitality. He, the man of science and data, had no explanation. His charts had not accounted for this. His models had not predicted it. He walked back to his truck in a daze. The condescension and pity he had felt for the old farmer were gone, replaced by a profound and unsettling sense of his own ignorance. He had not just been wrong. He had been fundamentally, arrogantly wrong. The climax of the story came not with a dramatic confrontation, but with the quiet, methodical process of the harvest. All through the late summer, the corn in the South 40 continued its incredible growth. By August, it towered over 15 feet tall, the stalks as thick as a man's wrist. Each stalk supported two, and in some cases three, large, heavy ears filled to the tip with deep, dented kernels. Arthur had to hire a specific, older model of combine for the harvest. The new, larger machines were not designed for stalks of such thickness. Their headers would have been damaged. He hired a man with a well-maintained Gleaner F2, a machine known for its robust construction. The harvest took 4 days. The old combine groaned under the strain of processing the massive plants, but it did the work. The grain auger poured a steady, golden stream of corn into the grain wagons. Arthur hauled the grain to the county elevator himself, load after load. At the elevator, each wagon was weighed, a moisture sample was taken, and the grain was graded. The owner of the elevator, a man who had known Arthur for 40 years, oversaw the weighing. After the first day, he came out of his office, holding a weigh slip, a look of disbelief on his face. "Arthur," he said, "this first load, it's coming in at over 200 bushels to the acre." Arthur just nodded. By the time the last wagon was emptied, the final tally was calculated. Daniel Hines was there. He had called ahead, asking to see the final numbers. The elevator owner handed him the printout. Hines stared at it, his face pale. The average yield for the South 40 was 224 bushels per acre. The valley average that year was 132. The best, most progressive farms, the ones that had followed every one of Hines's recommendations, had topped out at 160. Arthur Pearsall, with his old tractor and his fish heads, had not just beaten the average. He had shattered it. He had produced a yield that was considered a theoretical maximum, something you saw in university test plots, not on a real-world, played-out farm. The success was absolute and undeniable, quantified in black and white on the weigh slips. The grain quality was graded as number 1, fetching a premium price. The field that was a financial drain had become the most profitable 40 acres in the entire county. The laughter had long since stopped. Now, there was only a stunned, respectful silence. A week after the harvest was complete, Daniel Hines's white pickup truck once again drove down Arthur Pearsall's lane. This time, it moved slowly, hesitantly. Hines parked by the barn and got out. He was not carrying a clipboard. His usual air of confidence was gone, replaced by a quiet humility. He walked to the farmhouse, where Arthur was sitting on the porch, cleaning a piece of machinery. "Mr. Pearsall," Hines said, stopping at the bottom of the steps. He looked down at his boots for a moment before meeting the old man's eyes. "I came here to say I was wrong, completely and totally wrong, about your field, about your methods, about everything." The admission hung in the cool autumn air. It was a simple, direct statement, delivered without qualification or excuse. It was the hardest thing the young extension agent had ever had to say in his professional life. Arthur stopped his work. He looked at Hines, his expression unreadable. He did not smile. He did not gloat. He simply nodded, accepting the apology as a fact. "Coffee's on," he said, gesturing toward the door. Inside, at the simple wooden table in his kitchen, Arthur poured 2 cups of black coffee. For a long time, they sat in silence. Hines finally broke it. "I don't understand," he said, his voice quiet. "My tests showed that soil was inert. There was nothing there. No nitrogen, no phosphorus to speak of. The organic matter was non-existent. What you did, it shouldn't have been possible." Arthur took a slow sip of his coffee. He got up from the table and walked to a small desk in the corner. He came back with his father's leather-bound notebook and placed it on the table between them. He opened it to the page from 1948. "My father taught me," Arthur began, his voice calm and even, "that the mistake is to feed the plant. The chemical fertilizers you recommended, they feed the plant, but they do nothing for the soil. In fact, they harm it. They're like salts. They kill the life that's there." He tapped the notebook. "The soil isn't just dirt. It's a community. It's alive, or it's supposed to be. There are fungi, bacteria, worms, thousands of little creatures. That's what was missing from your tests. You were measuring the pantry, but you weren't looking for the cooks." Heinz listened, his entire being focused on the old farmer's words. The fish, Arthur continued, they weren't fertilizer in your sense. They were meal. A meal for that whole community. The fish breaks down, and the bacteria bloom. The fungi spread their networks, what they call mycorrhizae. They're little threads that go out and bring nutrients back to the plant roots. The worms come and tunnel, and that aerates the soil and lets the water in. The bones from the fish provide calcium and phosphorus, but slowly, the way the soil wants it. It's not a chemical dump. It's a revival. He looked out the window at the now bare field. You didn't see nitrogen in your tests because it wasn't there. It was locked up, unavailable. The life was gone. I didn't add nitrogen. I added life. The life then went and unlocked the nitrogen that was already in the soil, and it pulled nitrogen from the air. It built a new pantry. I didn't feed the corn. I fed the soil, and the soil, in turn, fed the corn. It was the most Arthur had spoken in years. The explanation was simple, elegant, and profound. It was a piece of wisdom that had been passed down through generations, a truth that could not be measured by a soil probe or quantified on a spreadsheet. Heinz sat in stunned silence, realizing he had spent his entire education learning to treat the symptoms of a problem, while this old man knew the cure for the disease itself. That conversation in Arthur Pearsall's kitchen marked a turning point for Daniel Heinz. He went back to the extension office, a changed man. He took his 20-page report on the South 40 and threw it in the trash. He began to read old agricultural texts, books from before the chemical revolution. He spent hours in the university library, researching soil biology, not soil chemistry. He went to his superiors with a radical proposal. He wanted to start a new pilot program. He wouldn't call it the Fish Head Program. He called it the Legacy Soil Restoration Initiative. He wanted to identify other played-out fields in the county and test Arthur's methods. He wanted to document the science behind the old wisdom. His bosses were skeptical, but the numbers from Arthur's harvest were undeniable. They could not ignore a 224-bushel yield. Reluctantly, they gave him a small budget and a 2-year window to prove his concept. Heinz asked Arthur to be a paid consultant. Arthur refused the money, but he agreed to help. He said he would show them, but they had to do the work. He wouldn't let them turn it into a purely academic exercise. Sarah Jenkins was put in charge of the project's day-to-day operations. She spent that next year shadowing Arthur. She learned how to read the land, not by its chemical composition, but by its color, its smell, its feel. She filled her own notebook with Arthur's quiet observations. She learned about the importance of cover crops, of minimal tillage at the right time, of returning organic matter to the earth. The fish were just one part of a larger, holistic system. The knowledge was being adopted. It was being translated from the language of generational wisdom into the language of modern science, but with the core principles intact. The lesson of the South 40 began to ripple outward, changing the way the Extension Office advised farmers, shifting the focus from short-term chemical fixes to long-term soil health. In the years that followed, the South 40 became a quiet legend in Harlan County. It was no longer called a failure. Farmers now referred to it simply as the fish field. Its high yields became the new normal, a consistent and expected outcome. It was a living demonstration that the land was not a resource to be mined, but a partner to be nourished. The field's success was no longer a shocking anomaly. It had become an accepted, respected part of the local geography and lore. It was simply true. Arthur Pearsall continued to farm it, but he was not alone. Sarah Jenkins was a frequent visitor, not as an agent, but as a student. She would walk the rows with him, learning to identify beneficial insects and to understand the subtle language of the plants. One crisp autumn afternoon, years after that first impossible harvest, Arthur was in his father's workshop. He was oiling the wooden handles of the old post-hole digger, the tool that had been the object of so much ridicule. The wood was dark and smooth, worn into perfect harmony with the human hand. It was a symbol, he thought, of the value of simple, durable things. It had outlasted dozens of newer, more complicated tools. He looked over at his father's workbench. Beside the old leather-bound ledger, there now sat a new notebook, one filled with Sarah's neat, precise handwriting. It contained her observations of the South 40, but it also had soil analysis reports, biomass calculations, and charts tracking microbial activity. It was the bridge between two worlds, the old knowledge validated by the new science. The door to the workshop creaked open, and Sarah came in. She was no longer a young assistant. She was now the head of the county extension office. Hines had moved on to a state-level position, where he was championing soil restoration programs across the region. "Arthur," she said, holding up her own field notebook, "I was looking at the winter wheat you planted as a cover crop. I noticed something." She flipped through the pages. "The earthworm castings are densest around the root clusters of the hairy vetch you interseeded. Do you think the vetch's nitrogen-fixing nodules are creating a more favorable environment for them? Or are the worm's channels helping the vetch establish faster?" Arthur looked at her. The question was not about yield or profit. It was a deep, insightful question about the intricate relationships within the soil community. It was a question his own father might have asked. He felt a quiet sense of satisfaction, the peace of a problem correctly solved and a lesson truly learned. He knew the knowledge was now safe. It was in good hands. He picked up a clean rag and began to wipe the excess oil from the tool handle. "I think," he said slowly, "that they're helping each other." The final thematic statement of the land was written not in words, but in the dark, rich soil of the South 40. It spoke of a simple, enduring truth. The earth is not a machine to be operated, but a living system to be understood. Its health is not a problem to be solved with chemistry, but a relationship to be nurtured with respect. Some knowledge does not become obsolete. It just waits patiently for people to remember why it was true.